Welcome to Landmark Talks Property, a podcast by Landmark Information Group that covers all things property in short and intelligent podcasts. In this episode, your host, Connie Alderson-Blench, who is Head of Professional Services at Landmark Information, is joined by Sally Redman, Customer Success Consultant at Landmark Information, Key Evans, Partner at Anstey, and Teresa Gonzalez-Rico, Associate Director at Atkins Realis. Today's discussion focuses on the role of data in development and how far it can take a transaction on its own, the misconceptions that often arise in conveyancing, and the growing influence of AI.
So I suppose following on from that, I wanted to talk about the role of data specifically in development. So how the role of data in development conveyancing sort of evolved over recent years. So we talked a bit about digitization and sharing of data. But are there certain, I suppose I'm thinking like Sally, Teresa, certain sort of problems that clients are coming to you with now that we're trying to solve using data compared to a few years ago?
Should I go? I mean, for us, as I said before, like my role was contaminated land, mainly contaminated land. Then it changed into flood risk. And now we're looking at future risks. So clients now want to see, okay, is the site going to flood? But what's it going to be like? Is it going to become worse as climate change, as we go through climate change and how the weather adapts to that? And same with subsidence as well. How is climate change going to affect subsidence, and what can we do to mitigate that risk so that they can build homes and infrastructure that lasts for hundreds of years?
Yeah, so I was just reflecting on that. So there is the kind of that scenario modeling as well, which obviously data can really empower, us to do that type of kind of future casting. Some of the work that we get involved in is probably more the here and now of how can data help us kind of accelerate infrastructure delivery, for example. So one of the pieces of work that I think it's an interesting challenge because it seems fairly straightforward and simple, but actually then it gets really complicated. But it's that typical example where you're walking down the road and a water company has opened up the ground to kind of fix something, and they're looking great. And then a week later it's over, and then 2 weeks after someone else has dug out the same hole, and you're like, okay, well, who is it now? Well, it's a energy company. And so one of the things that we kind of do as well is we've developed a kind of an approach, and we're not the only ones, but we are doing it in collaboration with some energy companies and water companies, and it's kind of around collaborative street work. So how can you use data to kind of help you coordinate, works that are happening? And so there is incentivization by the different kind of Ofgem and Ofwat regulators around now, kind of getting local authorities and companies incentivized to actually try and coordinate their roadworks. And actually to do that, you don't only need the data of what's under the ground and over the ground, but you also need some human coordination, right? And you need to kind of think about the governance of how you go about delivering these infrastructure projects in a different way. And then you start to get into the nitty-gritty of whether somebody's comfortable with kind of sharing a kind of contractor crew to, undertake their works kind of at the same time. What's the risk around that? And then there's also a little bit of the same as you were mentioning, which is it does also involve understanding what's your plan into the next year or 2 or 3 around your strategic infrastructure projects. So kind of using data to unlock something that seems pretty simple, it's actually quite hard, not because of the data, because of everything else, but like the outcome and the impact, not just socially, when anyone is trying to walk down the road, environmentally as well. And obviously there is some cost efficiency. So that's another example of kind of using data to unlock.
That's a really interesting one, because I think everybody would automatically assume it would be so simple
Yeah.
to bring all those people together and say, let's dig up the road once.
Yeah, you would.
Not 10
we can all
times.
see that's not happening.
Yeah.
can't we?
Yeah, exactly. And it's just one of those things. And then when you get into some of these other topics we're discussing, which I think they're probably much more complex as well. So yeah, but that's a good, it's one that always resonates with all of us because we kind of live it, right? So.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't think we've seen any sort of specific changes in client behavior, but certainly the knowledge that data is out there and the volumes of it is expected that good data will be obtained and that you can base your decisions on that data.
Yeah.
But it has to be accurate. Obviously, it has to be transparent. It has to be just fit for purpose, I suppose. So it's always those things really that we're concerned about on the data front.
I think with the sort of introduction of climate data, it's actually at Landmark we've sort of noticed quite a significant difference in that it's very fast changing, you know, and we haven't had that before. So if you think back, the last sort of piece of data that we were looking at that was brought into standard search reports was like flood data. That's quite a few years ago now.
Yeah.
Whereas actually climate data, it's ever evolving. There are so many different data suppliers coming through saying, you know, we've got great data on, you know, this peril. And it's for us, it's about definitely making sure the quality of that data, making sure it actually answers questions that, you know, our customers have, because I think sometimes it's about not having data for data's sake, but having it for a reason.
Yeah, like you want to make it sure that it's like site specific, don't you, as well? That it actually solves a problem rather than just having something that is quite large scale and doesn't really give you much insight.
So I suppose one other thing that we could talk about was at what point in a transaction or a development project does the data add the most value?
As soon as possible. right from the outset. I think that's certainly from my perspective, there's a danger in leaving it. You need to have that, you know, information right up front, and the better it is and the quicker it is, the smoother the transaction will be.
Do you think there's a danger that sometimes we're just relying on data, or if it's expected to do too much? And I mean, I suppose you were talking about that a little bit, Teresa, with the digging up the roads. But like just having data sometimes isn't enough, and people expect it to be.
Yeah, I guess it will depend on, I guess, the activity and the stage that you're in. I think that there is probably a certain type of data that is quite kind of clear cut. And if you can accelerate getting it into people's hands up front when you're starting that process, you know, that we should do everything that we can to do that. Then there is information like, for example, because we deal a lot with underground infrastructure, that's a big risk, because even if you have the best digital map in the world, until you dig, you don't know exactly where that pipe or cable is. So what we're doing is we are accelerating and bringing forward when you kind of get that information to the best of the knowledge and the kind of the records. And like the sooner you get that, the better, because it does already inform what you're going to do next. But I think that there is always going to be, you know, you always have to kind of bear in mind that depending on the data that you're dealing with, there's always going to be like that kind of inherent risk, whether, you know, if it's a property record, then that probably, I think it will be very specifically correct, because it's either or, you know, it's a name and it's a place. If you're thinking about underground data, then that's probably going to require some investigation later on in the process. But if you can have at least the initial view of what's recorded, then I think that adds a lot of value. So it will depend on the data that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I for, like, we look at a lot of historical maps, don't we? And there's definitely going to be some land uses that may not have come up as like a data point as such, and you actually need to have a look at that particular land use. For instance, petrol station. Sometimes you can see the outline as an environmental consultant. You can see the outline of the petrol station, but it hasn't actually come up. There's no records that say that there was a petrol station there and that there were any tanks associated with that site. So being able to, for us to be able to see that data, we can then say, oh yeah, there's a petrol station, raise the risk up, and say there's the potential then for underground storage tanks. Whereas if you didn't have somebody looking at it, then that may well have just been missed.
The human element is absolutely critical, isn't it? Because data will only take you so far as a baseline, ultimately. And whilst it's a great start, it's not going to catch all the nuances that a human looking at that could catch.
Yeah. I mean, for us, some local authority data, for instance, waste sites may actually be put in a slightly different place to where it potentially should be. And therefore, having an environmental consultant there to be able to look at all the records, we can say, oh, if that was actually on, they said it was on site, but we look at it and say, actually, no, it's not on site, it's next door. That's where we can enhance the value of just being able to interpret that data and being able to summarize all of the data that's there to then be able to give a risk assessment and then flag next steps.
I think for us in transactions, the data is sort of our baseline. That's, we take that and use that information as we need to. And after that, then you have to factor in lots of other features. There'll be the liability as a result of that data that you need to look at. If you've got a big transaction as well, it might be the human interplay as well. Behind every transaction, there's going to be people that are driving it. So what's their motivation? Why do they want this to happen? Is one being, particularly motivated by one thing, whereas the other party by something else? There's so many other things that contribute towards getting a development up and running and off the ground.
What type of data would you kind of initially look at? Just
it would be all the usual searches. We have to we have to apply for those. So we're looking at the flood risk. We're looking at contaminated land. All of those kind of searches. Yeah. But there are many things that won't come up in a search. If you've got a neighbour issue or something, what's happening in the wider area, which is a planning issue often. What's the land around the site allocated for? Yeah. Those kind of things don't always come up. So there are many other wider things that need to be taken into account as well.
It's interesting. So that kind of just threw a kind of a thought for me, which is that one of the things that we've been looking at recently was how could you apply? So this is kind of going way beyond data, and it's kind of saying how can you apply AI, around kind of in particular was around the planning system, and kind of being able to understand those conditions that are not just about, it's something that you can see through a camera, through Google Earth or some other way, but actually being able to grab information about what things are happening around where you're developing where you're planning to do a development, right? And kind of what has previously been approved or not approved, and what were the kind of the conditions that were given to someone else kind of building something nearby. And actually we were working with a small tech startup, Planning Hub, and they've been kind of focusing on that, and it's been just really interesting to see the next level of kind of layer of technology or kind of accelerating. At the end of the day, it would be something that somebody could spend a couple of days looking into and recording. But this is where you kind of start to think about the cost benefit of kind of developing tools that might help you do certain things, certain parts of the job faster. Again, the whole point of it is that there is always a person involved in that process, right? But yeah, that kind of like that contextual information about around a development is so important.
I think that's fascinating. I think the influence AI is going to have on things is going to be really interesting. As it moves from being sort of assistive at the moment, just sort of helping, to actually sort of doing more on its own and actually sort of running things, I think will be fascinating watching that. And as you say, ultimately, that's still only going to take you part of the way. That's not going to be able to tell you if you've got, someone that's motivated very differently to somebody else in a transaction, or, there'll be many elements that still need to be, you'll need a human for. Yeah,
it is interesting, isn't it? Because it's always been that professionals are there sort of to add context, so it's the added value of people. We can add context around individual sites, but actually maybe now it's not adding the context necessarily, because we can build programs, AI programs that might add the context. It's maybe finding the gaps, because I think that's where AI probably won't fill in, because it's really difficult to ask an AI program to know when they're looking through documents what's missing. Yeah. And I think rather than, a very direct what's happening around the outside.
Yeah. And it's going to be different in every case, because every sale is going to be different. Every transaction is going to be different, depending on where it is in the country, what features are a part of that transaction. So, I think AI has got, there's a long way to go before it's actually, doing that job. Definitely. But it's going to be interesting to see how it assists us in the meantime.
Yeah, I don't know. Have you had any kind of experience on the AI?
I haven't personally. I don't know if Connie, if you have anything. So but I've not had anything.
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because I think everyone has realised that AI is going to be used. Everybody has to invest in AI now. And it's at the moment, it's not necessarily sort of cost effective, I suppose, because everybody has old ways of doing it, and either you get data, computerized data, or you use people to interpret that. And actually what we've realized is that you need to add in the AI element, because it's not going away.
Yeah.
And so I think, so Landmark is definitely, looking into AI in all over, how it can help. And for us in Landmark Legal, it's definitely a focus on how it can help us do sort of the basics, so we can do the what's missing, add the context, do all of that around the outside. So it's about sort of making sure that our consultants are adding value that an AI can't, and in the meantime investing in AI to make sure that it can help us, because it's a really useful tool. Definitely. I think it's sometimes quite scary, how much is available. And there's a lot of, I know that, data suppliers, we use, so many different data suppliers. How do they feel about AI use of their data? So it's not just, a company's individual plan of how to use AI. It's all the information that we use, all the data that we use, and all the suppliers that we then have to get into conversations with. So it's really, it's a really interesting time.
I think we're seeing AI coming in various ways. I mean, for us, it's mostly document reviewing and that kind of thing at the moment. But I think the possibilities are, limitless, really, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a funny one, because also I don't classify myself as an AI expert by any means at all, and I'm always really kind of impressed with some of my colleagues whose expertise is that. It does feel sometimes like, maybe it's like putting a lot of hope on AI, and I do agree that I think there is a definite place for it, and to kind of help accelerate and maybe gain more insight faster. But I couldn't see how we could all do our jobs, without people kind of leading that charge. So but yeah, there is some really cool applications. So we had that example of kind of planning context, which kind of was relevant to the point.
Yeah, but I think there's there's always risks if you look at data without that human interpretation, right? And I think we're not at the stage where we're comfortable with an AI interpretation.
No.
Thanks for joining us for episode 2. In episode 3, we'll broaden the conversation with supplier and sector perspectives, from utilities and planning to the practical realities faced by legal teams and development consultants. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please hit subscribe. This podcast is for general information purposes only. The views expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not constitute professional advice.